Something happened last night that no one on Earth was prepared for. At exactly 11:47 p.m. UTC, the sky didn't just glow or blink or shift, it changed its mind. A silent, precise, impossible transformation rippled across the instruments of observatories on every continent, leaving the world's most seasoned astronomers staring at their screens in a kind of stunned disbelief normally reserved for science fiction. Minutes later, emergency lines that had never once been used outside of training simulations lit up simultaneously. Researchers from NASA, ESA, JAXA, the Indian Space Research Organization, and independent observatories from Chile to South Africa all reported the same thing. 3I Atlas had moved. Not drifted, not wobbled, not been nudged by a random burst of vapor or a natural outgassing plume. It had executed a maneuver so abrupt and so violently efficient that the first reaction of nearly every scientist monitoring the event was to assume a system failure. Servers were rebooted, calibrations were repeated, clocks were resynchronized, but the data kept matching. The numbers didn't flinch, the instruments weren't broken. For the first time in human history, a visitor from outside our solar system had done something no natural object in the universe should be able to do, something that required intention, calculation, and a kind of mastery over physics that we still treat as hypothetical. In the hours that followed, as emergency protocols cascaded across the global scientific community, one phrase kept appearing in encrypted message threads and private calls between the world's top physicists. This shouldn't be possible. And yet, it happened. It happened in real time, right in front of us. And it was only the beginning. Because as the orbital models were updated, models that normally remain stable for months or years unless something catastrophic intervenes, a second revelation emerged. 3I Atlas hadn't simply changed direction. It had chosen a new one. A path that placed it on a dramatically closer approach to Earth, shaving days off its predicted arrival window and tightening the distance of its flyby with a precision that no natural force could achieve. For decades, humanity has wondered whether we would know the moment first contact truly arrived. Would it be subtle, a quiet radio whisper from a distant star? Or overwhelming, a sudden arrival of unknown craft descending through our clouds? No one imagined it would begin like this, with an interstellar object calmly, silently altering its trajectory as if responding to an unseen signal or sending one. Inside control rooms from Houston to Madrid, analysts compared energy readings, thermal signatures, and electromagnetic anomalies, trying to stitch together an explanation. None fit. Every textbook on celestial mechanics suddenly felt outdated. Every rule we thought was universal snapped in half in the span of a few minutes. And behind all the data, all the charts, all the frantic calls and encrypted exchanges, a single, unsettling truth hung in the air. Something aboard 3I Atlas knew exactly what it was doing. Some scientists argued for caution, urging patience until further analysis could rule out unknown natural processes. Others insisted that what we witnessed was unmistakably deliberate, a controlled propulsion event executed with a level of sophistication far beyond anything humanity has ever built or even seriously envisioned. But even the skeptics grew quiet as more data streamed in. The thermal spike, the spectral flashes, the coordinated emissions, everything pointed to the same conclusion, one that no one dared to say aloud at first, until finally someone did. We're looking at technology, not theory, not speculation, not distant signals from another star system. Technology operating inside our solar system, right now. And with every new data point, every recalculated trajectory, every pulse of energy detected across the spectrum, one realization sank deeper into the minds of the scientists who witnessed it. If 3I Atlas can do this, then everything we thought we understood about isolation, rarity, and cosmic loneliness might have just collapsed overnight. Yet the most unsettling part wasn't the maneuver, or the energy release, or even the approach toward Earth. It was the sense, faint but growing, that this wasn't a random display of power. It felt like a message, a signal, a deliberate announcement of presence. And whatever 3I Atlas intends, whatever reason it has for revealing this capability now, whatever comes next, it's already in motion. Because last night, the universe didn't just break the rules. It told us something, and the meaning of that message is only beginning to unfold. Long before the trajectory shift set off alarms around the world, something else happened, something so violently out of place, so incompatible with everything we understand about the behavior of interstellar objects, that it triggered the first wave of disbelief. It began quietly, almost innocently, as part of a routine sequence of nightly observations. Telescopes were performing standard sweeps. Infrared arrays were gathering thermal data that had barely changed in months. Nothing suggested that 3I Atlas was about to break the universe's temperature rules in the most dramatic way imaginable. But then, without warning, the baseline readings flatlined, jittered, and then surged upward in a spike, so steep it looked like a malfunction, the kind of impossible vertical line that makes experienced researchers assume their instruments have finally given up. For decades, astronomers have dealt with equipment glitches, frozen sensors, cosmic ray hits, calibration drift. But this wasn't a glitch. It wasn't noise. It wasn't anything that could be dismissed with a reboot. At 11:47 PM UTC, the surface of 3I Atlas suddenly emitted a burst of heat that no natural process could account for. The temperature didn't slowly rise, it exploded upward, multiplying far beyond what an inert mass drifting through space should be capable of generating. Imagine a block of ancient rock, cold and silent after traveling between stars for untold ages, suddenly behaving like a reactor core pushed into overdrive. That's what the instruments recorded. It was as if something inside the object woke up. During that 90-second surge, the infrared signature climbed to levels typically associated with high-intensity energy systems, not comets, not asteroids, not dead interstellar debris. The spike didn't match anything on record, not volcanic activity, not tidal heating, not friction, not chemical outgassing. There was no natural model that could produce that kind of thermal violence in deep space. And more disturbing than the spike itself was the pattern hidden inside it. The increase wasn't chaotic, it wasn't messy. It had structure. When researchers zoomed into the thermal curve, they noticed something chilling. The rise wasn't smooth. It came in waves-controlled increments, stepped increases, as if some mechanism was regulating the output. The temperature would climb sharply, hold for a fraction of a second, then climb again. 3 steps, then a plateau, then another climb, like a machine warming up, like something running through a startup sequence. Scientists don't use phrases like startup sequence. They avoid language that implies intention. They default to the safest, most conservative explanations. But for the first time that night, even the most disciplined researchers struggled to keep that instinct alive. One analyst in Hawaii rewrote the same sentence in her report 5 times, deleting every word that might insinuate intelligence. She finally settled on, the object demonstrated a non-random thermal escalation with discrete intervals. But everyone reading it knew exactly what she was trying not to say. As the spike continued, more instruments chimed in. Radio telescopes began detecting faint broadband activity, not signals yet, not the structured transmissions that would appear later, but the unmistakable electromagnetic noise of energy systems under load. Meanwhile, optical arrays started noticing faint flickers, tiny bursts of light at wavelengths too sharp to be reflected sunlight. Something on 3I Atlas was generating its own illumination. Within minutes, data centers that normally sit in calm silence were buzzing with alert notifications. The thermal spike kept building, rising to a level that made even seasoned researchers lean forward in their chairs. At its peak, the energy output was so extreme that one astrophysicist described it as a torch flare visible across the solar system, except the numbers suggested something even more unsettling. The spike was localized. Only certain regions of the object were heating, the rest remained cold. Nature doesn't create that pattern, technology does. Then, as abruptly as it began, the entire event collapsed back to baseline. The heat signature dropped in a near-perfect curve, as if someone had flipped a switch. No lingering afterglow. No residual cooling pattern, just an immediate return to the quiet, frigid profile 3I Atlas had carried for months. That was the moment the confusion transformed into something else entirely, something closer to fear. because whatever happened wasn't a random reaction, it was controlled, measured, timed, and whatever caused it wasn't finished. As data analysts began comparing the before and after thermal maps, something more unsettling emerged. The spike had changed the object's rotational dynamics. Not enough to be obvious to the naked eye, but enough to disturb its internal thermal distribution. It wasn't just heating up, something inside it was moving. Across multiple observatories, researchers independently reached the same inevitable conclusion. This wasn't geological. This wasn't chemical. This wasn't natural. And yet, calling it technological felt equally terrifying, because that meant the thermal spike wasn't an effect. It was a sign that something aboard 3I Atlas had activated. And if the spike was the ignition, what happened immediately afterward would make the world realize it wasn't activation at all. It was the first step of something much, much bigger. Because minutes later, 3I Atlas didn't just glow. It moved. The thermal spike alone was enough to set the scientific world on edge. But what happened next ripped the floor out from under every theory, every model, every comfortable assumption humanity had about how objects move through space. Because only minutes after the impossible heat event collapsed, every tracking station tuned to 3I Atlas registered something they had never seen before. Not in comets, not in asteroids, not in planets, moons, or interstellar debris. The object changed its velocity. Not drifted, not nudged, not deviated by a predictable, physics-friendly amount. It accelerated. There are words scientists never expect to use when describing a 30 billion-ton interstellar object. Acceleration is one of them. On human scales, acceleration is simple: cars speed up, rockets ignite, planes lift off. But in the vacuum of space, for a body that large, moving that fast, any change in speed requires astronomical amounts of energy. Even the faintest adjustment normally takes months of accumulated force from sublimating gases or gentle gravitational influences. 3I Atlas didn't take months. It took minutes. The data came in as a flood of contradictory readings at first, so shocking that several observatories assumed someone else in the chain was sending corrupted telemetry. Tracking markers jumped. Orbital predictions broke, models refused to converge, but once the confusion settled and the data pipelines were cleaned and verified, a jaw-dropping truth remained. 3I Atlas had increased its velocity by thousands of meters per second in a single burst. That kind of change is not subtle. It's not accidental. It's not something that can be explained by natural jets of vapor or rotational instability. It was, by every definition we understand, a maneuver. And it wasn't gentle. Data analysts reported an acceleration curve so sharp it looked like a straight line, the kind of profile you'd expect from a machine firing up an engine, not a rock drifting in the dark. Every observatory that recorded the event described the same instantaneous shift. The object didn't glide into a new trajectory, it snapped into it. One orbital dynamics specialist described the data with a tone that wavered between awe and dread. Imagine trying to move a mountain. Now imagine that mountain responding instantly like a drone. The energy required for such a maneuver is beyond comprehension. Even the most advanced propulsion concepts, humans dream of massive laser sails, antimatter drives, nuclear pulse engines, would struggle to produce such a result. But 3I Atlas did it without hesitation, without preparation, without any sign of instability or structural strain. It moved with purpose, precision, and absolute control. As the new orbital path began to stabilize, it became obvious the maneuver wasn't random. The acceleration vector wasn't pointing off into empty space. It was deliberately angled inward, toward the heart of the solar system, toward us. Researchers across every major agency confirmed the same unsettling result. The object was now headed for a significantly closer approach to Earth. The predicted arrival window shifted dramatically. What was once a distant flyby had become something uncomfortably near. Suddenly, old philosophical questions took on terrifying weight. What does it mean when a non-natural object chooses to come closer? Why now? Why this path? Why demonstrate its capabilities so openly? In the midst of these questions, analysts dug deeper into the acceleration pattern itself. They found something even more disturbing. Natural objects, even unstable ones, tend to follow predictable curves. Dust jets push comets unevenly, but they do so with chaotic signatures. Fragmenting asteroids tumble, twist, and drift in ways that can be modeled but never perfectly pinned down. 3I Atlas didn't tumble. It didn't wobble. Its course change didn't introduce chaos. It executed the shift with the kind of clean, smooth precision that only controlled propulsion can create. There was no detectable rotational instability, no debris cloud, no plume, no thermal residue, nothing to suggest a natural origin. Instead, the energy signature during the maneuver matched something that looked eerily like directed thrust, but with no exhaust, no outflow, no heat trail, nothing resembling human-engineered propulsion. The object accelerated as if reality had temporarily bent around it, or as if it was exploiting a principle of motion humanity has never uncovered. The implications were staggering. Some scientists whispered theories too wild to publish: exotic energy manipulation, inertial dampening, field propulsion. Ideas that normally live in speculative physics papers were suddenly being treated as reasonable possibilities, because the data left no room for traditional explanations. But the velocity change wasn't the part that terrified researchers the most. It was the timing. The maneuver began exactly when the thermal spike ended, as if the heat event were not a random flare, but a charging cycle, a buildup, a catalyst, a switch. And whatever that switch activated, it gave 3I Atlas the ability to move through space with the kind of grace and authority usually reserved for engineered spacecraft not wandering interstellar relics. As the new predicted orbit propagated through global models, notifications cascaded across the astrophysics community. Conferences scheduled for the next month were canceled within hours. Emergency task forces formed in the middle of the night. Government agencies quietly alerted military and intelligence branches. Something enormous had just stepped onto the stage, and nobody knew whether it was simply passing by or approaching with intent. But the numbers didn't lie. The approach distance kept shrinking, the timeline kept tightening, and then something else emerged, something far stranger than the maneuver itself. Because once the models reconciled and the data stabilized, a new pattern became undeniable. 3I Atlas wasn't traveling alone. Smaller anomalies appeared near the object. Tiny motions, faint reflections, blips too precise to be noise. And if the maneuver broke physics, what came next would break our understanding of isolation entirely. Because 3I Atlas was no longer just one object, it was the beginning of a formation. When the orbital models finally stabilized, a silence fell across every control room that received the update. Not the quiet of relief, the quiet of realization. The maneuver wasn't just a demonstration of impossible propulsion. It wasn't just a burst of raw power meant to shock the scientific world. It was a correction, a choice, a deliberate adjustment of path with a clarity of intention that froze even the most skeptical minds. For months, 3I Atlas had been drifting on a predictable trajectory. Analysts had grown comfortable with its numbers, its arc, its projected flyby distance. Nothing about its motion hinted at awareness or purpose. It seemed poised to be another spectacular but harmless interstellar visitor, a once-in-a-generation puzzle for astronomers to admire from a safe distance. That illusion evaporated in a single update cycle. Instead of maintaining its distant curve, 3I Atlas now aligned itself toward the inner solar system with a precision that made the hairs on the neck of every orbital specialist stand up. It didn't simply passively allow gravity to shape its route. It steered, narrowing its path toward Earth as decisively as a ship correcting its course at sea. Before the maneuver, the closest approach had been distant enough to calm even the nervous analysts a high pass, interesting but not dangerous. After the maneuver, that distance shrank so dramatically that entire teams were ordered to recheck their calculations. They did, repeatedly. The answer stayed the same. 3I Atlas was coming closer, much closer. The timing changed too. Instead of arriving comfortably next year, the object would now reach its nearest point days earlier, the kind of adjustment no natural force could produce. The shift wasn't a minor refinement, It was a decisive move, the equivalent of a driver pressing the accelerator and cutting through a shortcut to arrive sooner. If the earlier thermal spike was a message, this was the translation. We're not just passing through, we're headed your way. Inside mission control centers, a strange duality took over the collision of scientific wonder and visceral dread. On one screen, the trajectory plot glowed with exquisite beauty, an elegant line curving toward Earth with mathematical grace. On another, analysts typed emergency protocols with hands that trembled despite decades of training. What made the approach even more disturbing wasn't just the reduction in distance, it was the precision of the adjustment. Nature is messy. Natural processes rarely draw straight lines or produce perfectly smooth curves. But the updated orbit of 3I Atlas looked engineered, calculated, almost surgical. Its new path threaded gravitational interactions in a way that made even seasoned navigators blink in disbelief. It avoided destabilizing influences with uncanny exactness, gliding through the solar system as if following a pre-planned route uploaded long before it arrived. And that raised a question no one wanted to say aloud, yet everyone was thinking, if 3I Atlas is following a plan, who created it? Theories exploded everywhere. Some scientists suggested reconnaissance, others proposed calibration, a test of its propulsion system. But a shadow hung behind every hypothesis, a possibility too dangerous to ignore. The object wasn't just adjusting its path for efficiency. It was adjusting its path to observe something, or someone. Earth. The psychological impact of that implication rippled across teams worldwide. Suddenly, decades of philosophical debates, extraterrestrial intelligence, the Fermi paradox, the nature of cosmic contact were no longer academic. They were logistical, immediate, urgent. In the early hours of analysis, researchers noticed something else. The path chosen by 3I Atlas positioned it perfectly for extended observation of Earth's magnetosphere, atmosphere, and radio emission lobes. It aligned with precision to optimize visibility of planetary rotation, thermal signatures, and artificial surface lights. It wasn't just approaching Earth, it was studying Earth. The more refined the models became, the clearer the intent appeared. This was not the path of a drifting relic. It was the trajectory of a probe or of something functioning like one. With every hour, new data points confirmed what few dared to articulate. The acceleration wasn't meant to intimidate, it was meant to announce. The approach wasn't reckless, it was calculated. No wasted motion, no unnecessary energy expenditure. A trajectory chosen the way an aircraft might line up for a survey pass. But then came the detail that truly shook the global community. The velocity change wasn't the end of the adjustments. Smaller course corrections appeared, subtle refinements, microvector shifts like tiny nudges guiding the object along its intended path. These changes were too fine, too deliberate, too synchronized to be explained by anything other than constant onboard correction. Something aboard 3I Atlas wasn't just active, it was steering. Even more unsettling, the micro-adjustments seemed to react to new data. Solar winds shifted, the trajectory compensated. Perturbations from planetary gravity wells corrected instantly. It moved with awareness, responding as though it had an internal map of the solar system or was generating one in real time. If the object was a machine, it was one far beyond our engineering. If it was a vessel, its operators were executing maneuvers with an elegance that bordered on artistry. And if it was neither, if it was something we lack the vocabulary to name, then humanity was witnessing a kind of technology that made our achievements look like primitive experiments. And yet, even this wasn't the part that shattered the scientific community. Because as the trajectory tightened and the object moved with unmistakable purpose, faint anomalies began appearing around it, small fluctuations, tiny reflections, subtle deviations in photometric readings. At first they were dismissed as noise, then as sensor artifacts. But as hours passed, the anomalies multiplied. They organized, they moved, they synchronized. And suddenly, the terrifying truth became impossible to deny. 3. Atlas wasn't coming alone. Something else was moving with it. Silent, precise, coordinated. Whatever this was, a fleet, an escort, a swarm, it would rewrite the narrative in ways far more unsettling than a trajectory change. Because an approach is one thing. An approach in formation is something else entirely. And the formation was just beginning to reveal itself. Long before anyone fully understood the implications of the trajectory shift or the presence of smaller companions orbiting near 3I Atlas, something else began to unfold, something stranger, louder, and infinitely more difficult to rationalize. As the object continued its approach, observatories around the world started detecting unusual activity across nearly every segment of the electromagnetic spectrum. What had once been a silent traveler suddenly became a beacon, flooding the sky with signals that defied natural classification. It began with the radio bands. Static, or what everyone assumed was static, started to ripple faintly through large dish arrays in New Mexico, Argentina, Western Australia, and South Africa. At first, the activity was faint enough to ignore, the kind of background hiss that astrophysicists normally filter out automatically. But as the hours passed, the noise sharpened, it gained edges, patterns, intervals. It stopped behaving like noise. Radio engineers who had spent their entire careers filtering cosmic interference suddenly found themselves staring at graphs that looked engineered. The signal strength rose and fell with uncanny regularity, shifting not in random bursts but in sweeping modulated arcs. Waves within waves, layers of structure woven together like some kind of celestial fabric. One radio technician described the moment she recognized the pattern. It felt like hearing a voice behind a crowd, muffled, indirect, but unmistakably intentional. But the radio activity was just the opening act. Next came the optical flashes. Telescopes designed to capture photons from distant galaxies began registering bursts of visible light from 3I Atlas, but these weren't reflections of sunlight or cosmic rays. They were pulses, clean, sharp, monochromatic, a kind of luminous heartbeat, flickering in sequences too deliberate to be natural. The first flashes came in rapid bursts, then slowed, then repeated. High-speed cameras captured the intervals and found them consistent to several decimal places. No natural phenomenon produces timing like that. Stars flicker chaotically, reflected light scatters, plasma arcs in unpredictable arcs. But 3I Atlas was signaling with the precision of a metronome. Some flashes came in deep cobalt tones, others in razor-bright greens, not a spectrum discrete wavelengths, chosen deliberately. Researchers quickly realized that these emissions corresponded to specific atomic transitions, the kind used in high-energy laser systems. Except no one had ever seen such systems produced by a comet-like body hurtling through space. The question no one wanted to voice became impossible to avoid. Was 3I Atlas communicating? Even before anyone could answer, a new phenomenon erupted, this time in the high-energy domain. X-ray observatories, stationed in orbit and on Earth, began recording intermittent bursts of radiation coming from the object. X-rays are typically born in environments of extreme violence, collapsing stars, superheated matter, raging magnetic storms. But the X-rays from 3I Atlas didn't resemble those chaotic sources. They were clean, narrow, sharp, pure. Scientists accustomed to studying the remnants of exploding suns struggled to reconcile the idea of a compact, cold interstellar object emitting the kind of radiation normally reserved for exotic astrophysical engines. Some spectra even showed spikes at energies associated with particle collisions, the kind you'd see inside a man-made accelerator, not drifting through deep space. By the time the X-ray data hit the international networks, analysts no longer attempted to fit the emissions into natural categories. The patterns were too refined, the timing too measured, the energy too tightly regulated. This wasn't the universe acting out. This was something operating. The most unsettling realization came when teams began cross-referencing the emissions, the radio waves, the optical flashes, the X-ray bursts. They weren't isolated events, they were synchronized. Signals in one band anticipated signals in another. Timing patterns echoed across wavelengths. It was as if 3I Atlas was a multi-channel transmitter broadcasting through the sky, layering different types of information atop one another. The way complex digital systems use multiple carriers to increase bandwidth. For the first time, it became clear that humanity wasn't simply observing an energy event, it was observing a system. A system built by something intelligent. A system that seemed to be operating at full capacity. A system that was designed to be noticed. Across late-night calls and hastily organized emergency meetings, experts whispered analogies they barely believed. It's like a modem handshake, but cosmic. It's transmitting across every channel at once. This is a multi-layered communication suite. But the truth was even more disturbing. The signals weren't directed outward in a single direction. They radiated in all directions like a broadcast. And if something broadcasts, it does so with an audience in mind. While the patterns themselves were mesmerizing, what truly shook analysts came from deeper analysis. Some emissions repeated with microscopic precision, functioning almost like synchronization markers. Others seemed to embed substructures' potential data. And still others peaked in ways that suggested modulation, encoding, and organization. But the moment that froze even the most seasoned scientists came when multiple observatories realized that the radio pulses carried harmonics, secondary signals riding atop primary ones, subtle enough to miss unless carefully isolated. Those harmonics were deliberate, artificial, structured. And as analysts worked through the layers, isolating one pattern after another, the signals began to reveal a hint of something impossible. Intentionality, thought, purpose. Whatever 3 Atlas was doing, it wasn't reacting to the environment. It wasn't shedding heat. It wasn't sputtering through natural processes. It was communicating. But communicating with whom? Us? Something else nearby? Something across the stars? Every possibility was equally terrifying. And just when the international teams believed they had grasped the scale of what was unfolding, something even stranger appeared hidden deep within the pulse structure, buried under layers of electromagnetic noise. A repeating sequence, a pattern that returned with perfect precision, a message waiting to be unlocked. And decoding that first layer would open the door to a revelation far more unnerving than the signals themselves. Because the message wasn't coming from a single source. It was coming from multiple objects, moving in formation. By the time the multiband emissions had stabilized into repeating patterns, the scientific world had already crossed an invisible psychological threshold. This was no longer about astrophysics. It wasn't about comets, debris, thermal anomalies, or exotic matter. It was about communication, and communication implies a sender. Still, no one expected what came next. As teams around the globe synchronized their datasets and began layering radio, optical, and high-energy signals on top of one another, something uncanny emerged from the static. Beneath the noise, beneath the pulses, beneath the structured emissions, there was a recurring sequence, a loop repeating at precise intervals, as though 3i Atlas were reciting something on a schedule. At first, analysts assumed it was a beacon, a kind of "I am here" signal, but as they stripped away the spectral layers and isolated the core pattern, they realized this wasn't a simple broadcast, it was a primer. The signal began with a mathematical elegance that felt almost unnerving in its clarity. Simple ratios at first, then harmonic intervals, then numerical relationships that grew more complex with each repetition, patterns no natural source would ever produce. Not rhythmic, not chaotic, intentional, the kind of structure that any civilization, no matter how alien, would expect a technologically capable species to recognize. Prime numbers appeared, then geometric symmetries, then harmonic cascades that mapped perfectly onto universal constants. It was as if the source of the signal had chosen the most fundamental language in existence, mathematics, to reach out across the void. One analyst described the moment she realized what she was seeing. It was like the universe tapping us on the shoulder and saying, "Pay attention. This part is for you." And yet, something was wrong. The deeper researchers went into the sequence, the more they realized the message wasn't behaving like a standard transmission. It didn't unfold linearly. It wasn't structured the way humans would encode information. It branched, it nested, it folded back on itself. Some segments compressed into tight bursts, while others stretched into elongated, almost melodic expansions. The signal's architecture felt alive, like it was adjusting itself based on unknown variables. Some theorists even suggested it might be adaptive, designed to change based on what it detected in the electromagnetic environment. Then came the breakthrough. A small research group in Finland discovered that the seemingly inconsistent timing variations weren't errors, they were instructions. The message wasn't meant to be decoded in the order it was received. It had to be reassembled, rearranged, folded, like an origami of data. Once reorganized, the scattered pieces formed a coherent structure, a scaffold of pure mathematics, establishing a shared framework between sender and recipient. The message was teaching us how to read it. And once the primer fully revealed its shape, the signal transitioned into something far more shocking. Hidden behind the mathematical layer was a second structure, this one less orderly, but unmistakably deliberate. Patterns that resembled linguistic fingerprints began appearing. Repeated motifs, weighted distributions, clustered rhythms. Where mathematics was the handshake, this was the voice. Through deep pattern analysis, several language theorists identified telltale signs of syntax, not human syntax, not even necessarily spoken syntax, but the unmistakable statistical footprints of structured information. Something was being encoded, something richer than numbers, something that felt like meaning. For the first time, humanity was staring at what might be an extraterrestrial language. But then came the twist, something no one saw coming. Something that changed the scale of the mystery entirely. As more telescopes and receivers joined the global network, analysts noticed the signal wasn't spatially uniform. Different observatories were detecting microscopic variations, tiny shifts in frequency, timing, and modulation. When those variations were mapped onto the sky, they formed a pattern. There wasn't just one transmitter. There were multiple transmitters. Different parts of the message were coming from different points around 3I Atlas and not randomly. The emissions lined up perfectly with the anomalous smaller objects detected earlier. The faint companions moving in synchronized formation. This wasn't a single probe broadcasting a message. It was a network, a coordinated array, a system of transmitters working together like nodes in a distributed machine. Some modules sent high-frequency bursts. Others delivered broadband carriers. Others pulsed optical signals with surgical precision. Together, they formed a multi-layered communication suite far more sophisticated than anything humanity has ever built. The implications were staggering. If this was deliberate communication, then the smaller objects weren't debris. They weren't fragments. They weren't accidents. They were part of the design. Each one played a role. Each one carried a piece of the message. Each one acted as a node in an intelligent, interconnected system. A scientist from the Japanese array whispered what many were thinking. This isn't a visitor, it's an architecture. But what was the message? Why send it now? And why reveal its complexity in layers, as if guiding humanity through a cosmic literacy test? Teams continued decoding, peeling back the strange, intricate patterns, and that's when another revelation struck. One even more unsettling than the existence of alien language. Some portions of the signal didn't correspond to mathematics or communication theory. They corresponded to spatial data, coordinates, angles, distances, orbital diagrams, three-dimensional positional maps. If the analysis was correct, 3I Atlas wasn't just transmitting information about itself. It was transmitting information about something else. Its origin, perhaps. Its destination. Or another object entirely. But one fragment of the decoded data stood out among all others, a repeating set of spatial markers that, when plotted, didn't point outward into deep space. They pointed inward, toward the inner solar system, toward a point still unconfirmed, toward something we hadn't detected yet. And as the fragments of the message grew clearer, one terrifying possibility began to emerge, a possibility that no one wanted to say aloud. What if the message wasn't meant for us? What if it was meant for something already here? Because the next section of data hinted at coordination, at timing, at rendezvous. And if that was true, the formation around 3I Atlas was not approaching alone. It was approaching to meet something. For hours, scientists tried to convince themselves that the faint objects appearing around 3I Atlas were an illusion, sensor artifacts, reflections, imaging noise, anything but what they seemed to be. But the universe has a habit of stripping away denial with cold, unforgiving clarity, and that clarity arrived in the form of synchronized motion. First there were 2, then 4, then 6. Each detected independently across multiple observatories, each dismissed at first, each eventually confirmed as real. Small objects smaller than 3I Atlas by orders of magnitude drifting near it with impossible precision. They weren't drifting, though. They were holding position. Anyone who has ever watched debris clouds orbit a central body knows the motion is chaotic. Fragments scatter, drift, tumble, spiral unpredictably. Gravity isn't gentle, it tears structures apart. But these objects defied that chaos. They didn't drift, they hovered, maintaining fixed separations, matching velocity changes instantly, adjusting micro-positions with the grace of something actively controlling its own movement. And that was the detail that finally shattered every lingering attempt at a natural explanation. Debris doesn't coordinate. Debris doesn't correct for drift. Debris doesn't maintain geometric layouts. But these objects did all of that and something even more unnerving. They reacted to one another. When one shifted position by a fraction of a degree, the others responded within milliseconds. A subtle lean inward here, a fractional drift outward there, all of it too precise to be coincidence. Their movements resembled a kind of celestial choreography, an autonomous network making real-time adjustments to maintain formation stability. For the first time since the event began, scientists stopped asking whether the smaller objects were part of the same system. They started asking what system they belonged to. The formation wasn't random. When mapped in 3 dimensions, the objects arranged themselves in a pattern that didn't correspond to any known gravitational resonance or orbital configuration. Instead, they aligned in what looked disturbingly like an array, a geometry optimized for angular coverage, a structure designed to collect or transmit information. Each unit occupied a strategic position around the main body. Each unit maintained angular spacing with astonishing consistency. Each unit responded as though it had awareness of the others. If this was a probe, then the smaller objects were its instruments. If this was a ship, then the smaller objects were its drones. If this was something else entirely, no human vocabulary could capture it. The first attempt to map the formation produced an image that circulated quietly among international teams before anyone dared release it publicly. The layout resembled an expanding polyhedron, a shape eerily similar to communication arrays used in deep space networks, except magnitudes more complex. Every angle corresponded to different signal strengths detected earlier. Every position correlated with bursts of electromagnetic activity. The system wasn't just transmitting, it was surveying. One researcher summarized it in a single sentence that spread through internal channels like wildfire. We're looking at a mobile sensor constellation. But if these were sensors, what were they studying? Earth? The solar system? Each other? Us? That answer remained elusive, but the behavior of the smaller objects grew increasingly intentional as 3I Atlas continued its approach. During periods of increased emissions, the formation tightened as if bracing or focusing. During moments of silence, the formation expanded like an array scanning or absorbing. Some of the most advanced interferometers detected faint pulses emanating not from 3I Atlas itself, but from the smaller units. Short bursts, high frequency, coordinated. They responded to one another like nodes in a distributed AI mesh, not like independent objects. And then came the moment that forced every nation to move from curiosity to alarm. One of the smaller objects accelerated, not wildly, not unpredictably, not chaotically. It adjusted its distance from 3I Atlas with absolute precision. It shifted position, held it, then shifted again as if testing its mobility. Nothing in nature behaves like that. The acceleration profile matched the exact style of the main object's earlier maneuver, but scaled down like a miniature demonstration of capability. No plume, no thermal bloom, no visible propulsion. Just movement. Clean, seamless, controlled. That was the instant governments began drafting emergency protocols. Because for the first time, it became undeniable. These weren't pieces of a comet. These were machines. Machines operating in formation. Machines acting with purpose. Theories began to evolve rapidly. Some suggested these smaller units were scouts, designed to analyze the environment in multiple wavelengths simultaneously. Others believed they were communication amplifiers, linking with the main object to form a long-distance relay system. A few proposed they were defensive, autonomous guardians, ensuring nothing interfered with the primary vessel. But one possibility overshadowed all the others. They were preparing for something. Not in an aggressive way, not yet, but in a coordinated one. The timing of their behavior aligned too closely with the complex signals detected earlier. As the encoded message grew clearer, as more layers were decoded, the smaller objects tightened their formation in a way that seemed anticipatory. And then, an even stranger anomaly appeared. As independent researchers mapped the objects' positions over time, they noticed a slow drift in orientation, not random, not reactionary, a deliberate rotation. The formation was turning, aligning, pointing toward a region of space far ahead of their trajectory, a region suspiciously close to Earth. This wasn't the behavior of a passive system. It was the behavior of a preparing system. Something was coming, not tomorrow, not next decade, soon. And as the smaller objects aligned, synchronized, and stabilized into their final configuration, one terrifying realization crystallized across every analysis team. The formation wasn't scanning the solar system. It was scanning for a response. Something had been transmitted. Something had been sent out. And now the entire array was waiting. Waiting for what? A reply? A confirmation? A signal from Earth? Or something from somewhere else entirely? No one knew. But the next hours would force every government, every agency, and every scientific institution to act fast. Because whatever 3I Atlas and its coordinated formation were doing, Earth was already part of it. And the countdown to humanity's first direct response had begun. As the formation tightened around 3I Atlas and the coordinated signals became impossible to ignore, the scientific world shifted from observation to mobilization. Curiosity gave way to urgency. Theories gave way to protocols. Within hours, Earth's response had evolved from fragmented chatter into the closest thing humanity has ever had to a planetary emergency posture. For decades, governments had quietly drafted hypothetical first contact frameworks, academic exercises stored in forgotten folders, written by committees who never believed their proposals would see daylight. Now, those dusty frameworks were suddenly pulled into the world's brightest rooms as officials demanded answers no one had ever expected to provide. The earliest reaction came from the scientific community itself. As soon as the global network confirmed that 3I Atlas's smaller companion objects were moving in coordinated geometric configurations, undeniably artificial, every major research institution initiated emergency consultation. Channels, astrophysicists, linguists, communication theorists, military analysts, protocol architects, and even behavioral scientists were pulled into round-the-clock calls. Sleep vanished from calendars. Days blurred. The world felt like it had been scooped out of its familiar axis and placed into something raw and unmapped. NASA was the first to issue an internal directive, all available sensors, continuous monitoring, no downtime. The European Space Agency initiated Skywatch mode, aligning the Hubble, Webb, and ground networks toward fixed observation of the object. China activated its deep space arrays. India deployed auxiliary receivers that had never before been used in an extraterrestrial context. Even smaller nations contributed by pointing amateur and university telescopes upward, creating a diffraction pattern of global vigilance unlike anything seen in human history. And still, the data piled faster than it could be processed. Then came the political response. By dawn, the United Nations had convened an emergency session, issuing a sealed briefing to world leaders that left more than one head of state visibly shaken. Faced with information that shattered centuries of certainty, leaders asked questions that revealed just how unprepared humanity truly was. Is this a threat? Is this peaceful? Is this the beginning of something larger? Should we hide this from the public? Do they know we exist? Do they know we're watching? The scientific advisors had no comforting answers. What they could say, however, changed everything. The object responded to physical laws with intelligence. The formation responded to each other with coordination. The signals responded to nothing we've seen yet. But all behavior suggests anticipation. They expect something. That word expect rippled across the assembly like an electric charge. If 3 Atlas was expecting something, then Earth had to decide whether to respond and how. Within hours, a global contact strategy group was formed, an unprecedented coalition of SETI experts, communication theorists, cryptographers, diplomats, and philosophers. Their task wasn't simply to craft a message. Their task was to craft humanity's first sentence in the cosmic conversation. And that responsibility carried a weight no committee had ever faced. The debate split quickly into competing factions. One group argued for caution, to send nothing until humanity could decode more of the multi-layered message. Another insisted that waiting was itself a message, one that could be misinterpreted as fear or hostility. A third group pressed for immediate action, claiming that silence could escalate risk. But there was a fourth group, the one that spoke the quiet truth others didn't want to hear. They already know we're here. The signals map Earth's electromagnetic signature. Waiting doesn't hide us. In the corridors behind the conference rooms, another conversation took place, one darker, lined with tension and whispered in tones normally reserved for national security threats. Military strategists, intelligence agencies, and defense alliances assessed the object with cold logic. They asked what no scientist wanted to confront. If this is a threat, what can we do? The answer arrived quickly, stark and unanimous. Nothing. Humanity had no weapons capable of reaching the object. No propulsion capable of matching its maneuvers. No sensors capable of perceiving it in full detail. No technology capable of protecting Earth if its intentions turned hostile. For the first time in modern history, every major world power understood that all human conflict was irrelevant. Borders meant nothing. Military advantage meant nothing. Alliances meant nothing. Humanity was one species, one planet, one fragile intelligence, standing beneath something far older, far more advanced, and undeniably aware of our existence. That realization sparked 2 parallel responses. The scientific world intensified its efforts to decode the message. The political world prepared for disclosure because with every hour that passed, too many people already knew. Observatory teams, satellite operators, academic networks, amateur astronomers, data analysts, coders, radio hobbyists. The truth wasn't containable. So a decision was made, the public had to know. But the announcement couldn't come unprepared. Every word had to be balanced between honesty and calm. The United Nations began drafting a statement that would become the most important address ever broadcast. Meanwhile, the Contact Strategy Group finalized something equally monumental, the first human reply. The message would begin with simple mathematics, echoing the primer structure 3 Atlas seemed to expect, then planetary identifiers. Then neutral signaling patterns that conveyed peaceful intent without revealing sensitive details about Earth's defenses or vulnerabilities. The global transmission arrays were scheduled, the signal window calculated, the encoding verified. And as humanity prepared to send its first message to whatever intelligence had crafted the formation, drifting silently through the void, a new wave of panic swept through the world, not political panic, not military panic, but something deeper and more primal. Because as the final details were being arranged, new data came in. A shift, subtle but undeniable. 3I Atlas and its smaller companions were adjusting their formation, turning, reconfiguring, aligning in a way no one had yet seen. It wasn't random. It wasn't reactionary. It wasn't chaotic. It was symmetrical, perfectly symmetrical, as if preparing for synchronization. or calibration, or reception. And suddenly, every analyst watching the data feeds reached the same chilling conclusion. They knew we were about to respond, and they were preparing for it. But humanity didn't yet understand whether that preparation meant welcome or warning. As the formation tightened around 3I Atlas and the coordinated signals became impossible to ignore, the scientific world shifted from observation to mobilization. Curiosity gave way to urgency. Theories gave way to protocols. Within hours, Earth's response had evolved from fragmented chatter into the closest thing humanity has ever had to a planetary emergency posture. For decades, governments had quietly drafted hypothetical first contact frameworks, academic exercises stored in forgotten folders, written by committees who never believed their proposals would see daylight. Now, those dusty frameworks were suddenly pulled into the world's brightest rooms as officials demanded answers no one had ever expected to provide. The earliest reaction came from the scientific community itself. As soon as the global network confirmed that 3I Atlas's smaller companion objects were moving in coordinated geometric configurations, undeniably artificial, every major research institution initiated emergency consultation channels. Astrophysicists, linguists, communication theorists, military analysts, protocol architects, and even behavioral scientists were pulled into round-the-clock calls. Sleep vanished from calendars. Days blurred. The world felt like it had been scooped out of its familiar axis and placed into something raw and unmapped. NASA was the first to issue an internal directive: all available sensors, continuous monitoring, no downtime. The European Space Agency initiated Skywatch mode, aligning the Hubble, Webb, and ground networks toward fixed observation of the object. China activated its deep space arrays. India deployed auxiliary receivers that had never before been used in an extraterrestrial context. Even smaller nations contributed by pointing amateur and university telescopes upward, creating a diffraction pattern of global vigilance unlike anything seen in human history. And still, the data piled faster than it could be processed. Then came the political response. By dawn, the United Nations had convened an emergency session, issuing a sealed briefing to world leaders that left more than one head of state visibly shaken. Faced with information that shattered centuries of certainty, leaders asked questions that revealed just how unprepared humanity truly was. Is this a threat? Is this peaceful? Is this the beginning of something larger? Should we hide this from the public? Do they know we exist? Do they know we're watching? The scientific advisors had no comforting answers. What they could say, however, changed everything. The object responded to physical laws with intelligence. The formation responded to each other with coordination. The signals responded to nothing we've seen yet. But all behavior suggests anticipation. They expect something. That word, expect, rippled across the assembly like an electric charge. If 3I Atlas was expecting something, then Earth had to decide whether to respond and how. Within hours, a global contact strategy group was formed, an unprecedented coalition of SETI experts, communication theorists, cryptographers, diplomats, and philosophers. Their task wasn't simply to craft a message. Their task was to craft humanity's first sentence in the cosmic conversation. And that responsibility carried a weight no committee had ever faced. The debate split quickly into competing factions. One group argued for caution, to send nothing until humanity could decode more of the multi-layered message. Another insisted that waiting was itself a message, one that could be misinterpreted as fear or hostility. A third group pressed for immediate action, claiming that silence could escalate risk. But there was a fourth group, the one that spoke the quiet truth others didn't want to hear. They already know we're here. The signals map Earth's electromagnetic signature. Waiting doesn't hide us. In the corridors behind the conference rooms, another conversation took place, one darker, lined with tension and whispered in tones normally reserved for national security threats. Military strategists, intelligence agencies, and defense alliances assessed the object with cold logic. They asked what no scientist wanted to confront. If this is a threat, what can we do? The answer arrived quickly, stark and unanimous. Nothing. Humanity had no weapons capable of reaching the object, no propulsion capable of matching its maneuvers, no sensors capable of perceiving it in full detail, no technology capable of protecting Earth if its intentions turned hostile. For the first time in modern history, every major world power understood that all human conflict was irrelevant. Borders meant nothing, military advantage meant nothing, alliances meant nothing. Humanity was one species, one planet, one fragile intelligence standing beneath something far older, far more advanced, and undeniably aware of our existence. That realization sparked two parallel responses. The scientific world intensified its efforts to decode the message. The political world prepared for disclosure because with every hour that passed, too many people already knew. Observatory teams, satellite operators, academic networks, amateur astronomers, data analysts, coders, radio hobbyists. The truth wasn't containable. So a decision was made. The public had to know. But the announcement couldn't come unprepared. Every word had to be balanced between honesty and calm. The United Nations began drafting a statement that would become the most important address ever broadcast. Meanwhile, the Contact Strategy Group finalized something equally monumental, the first human reply. The message would begin with simple mathematics, echoing the primer structure 3I Atlas seemed to expect, then planetary identifiers. Then neutral signaling patterns that conveyed peaceful intent without revealing sensitive details about Earth's defenses or vulnerabilities. The global transmission arrays were scheduled, the signal window calculated, the encoding verified, and as humanity prepared to send its first message to whatever intelligence had crafted the formation drifting silently through the void, a new wave of panic swept through the world, not political panic, not military panic, but something deeper and more primal. Because as the final details were being arranged, new data came in. A shift, subtle but undeniable. 3I Atlas and its smaller companions were adjusting their formation, turning, reconfiguring, aligning in a way no one had yet seen. It wasn't random. It wasn't reactionary. It wasn't chaotic. It was symmetrical, perfectly symmetrical, as if preparing for synchronization, or calibration, or reception, and suddenly every analyst watching the data feeds reached the same chilling conclusion. They knew we were about to respond, and they were preparing for it. But humanity didn't yet understand whether that preparation meant welcome or warning.